I am Tamar Ishalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads. Over the past year, we've heard so much about the upheaval on college campuses across the U.S., protests, encampments, intense confrontations, and just as much, we've seen how university administrations have struggled, often totally failed to respond. But in the middle of all this, one Ivy League school has taken a different approach with a different outcome. Dartmouth stands out, not for more chaos, but for a story that offers something rare these days, a sense of hope. And at the heart of that story is Professor Susannah Heschel. As a professor of Jewish studies and daughter of the legendary Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a philosopher, activist, and one of the great moral voices of the 20th century, she brings a unique perspective to this moment. I'm really lucky to have her with me today to talk about what happened at Dartmouth, what made the difference, and why. We'll also dive into her powerful recent article where she makes the case that anti-Semitism isn't just hatred, it's cultural sadism. What does that mean? And of course, we'll reflect on her father's extraordinary legacy and why his voice still speaks so urgently to the reality we're living in right now. Shalom, Professor Heschel, and welcome to Jewish Crossroads.
Thank you, Shalom. It's so wonderful to be with you.
We're talking about the Dartmouth University example. Take us back to the morning of October 7th. How did this all begin from your perspective?
So October 7th was Shabbat, and that evening, Motzei Shabbat, was Simchas Torah. So I went to the synagogue, my synagogue around the corner, which is Orthodox, and we were starting to hear little bits of news about an attack in Israel. We didn't have the full story. But I had a terrible feeling that something major, a major catastrophe had occurred, a catastrophe for Israel and a catastrophe for Jews all over the world. That was my feeling. And I was very agitated and upset. The next day, my colleague, who is the chair of the Middle Eastern Studies program at Dartmouth, phoned me. He was in Cairo about to lead a group of alumni on a tour, which of course was canceled. But I heard in his voice a sound of devastation. I heard a reflection of how I was feeling. And I told him that I was planning to hold a gathering of faculty from our building at Dartmouth to talk about the terrible massacre and try to process it somehow and discuss how we would present this to our students and so forth. And my colleague, Tariq El-Aris, who was born in Lebanon, by the way, and is a scholar of Arabic literature of the 19th century, said to me, why don't you open it up? Let the students come, let everybody come, get a bigger room. And so I emailed our administrative assistant, Jennifer Thomas, and I asked her to book 2 rooms for us, Tuesday, Thursday, which is the time when we hold major events on campus. And I asked 3 of my colleagues to join me, colleagues who are in Middle Eastern studies. But then something remarkable happened, which is that at 9 a.m. on Monday, I received a phone call from the dean of faculty who told me that the president of Dartmouth, who just arrived as a new president, had asked her to get in touch with me to see if I could organize a dialogue in response to what had happened. And I told her we've already organized it. But I have to say this is very important, that this initiative came from faculty and also from the president of the institution. The president turned to the faculty. Now, of course, the background of this is also that we have been working very closely for many years, Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies, collaboratively. We cross-list courses, we co-teach classes, we organize speakers and workshops. We have students who major in both. They combine the major in Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies. And that's really what we want at Dartmouth. We've worked for this. So when we convened our 2 faculty forums, the room was packed. I hadn't expected it. I would say 95% students. We had a live stream. Everything was organized thanks to the support of the president, by the way. And what did we want to do? We wanted, of course, answer questions. But the more important issue was to demonstrate to students how we respond to a horrific massacre like this in an academic setting. The students can go to a psychologist, they can go to a chaplain, they go to the synagogue, so forth. But how do we as academics speak to each other? We wanted to demonstrate to them how we talk to one another with respect, with dignity. We're somber. We were upset. I had just returned a month earlier from Israel. I was very upset, of course. And some of the students asked some harsh questions, but they did it respectfully. We modeled for them, and they responded.
What were the actual conversation like in the room? Which questions were you asked that are interesting you can remember today?
Some students stood up and just expressed how upset they were. Some made comments that I found hard to hear. Our response in some cases was, we're not here to litigate the past. We're here to learn. Or, are you here to make a statement or are you here to learn something? So we wanted to direct them to classes, to thinking, to learning, and to being respectful. And respectful that we had a room of people from many different parts of the world and many different backgrounds, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and so on. We are a community. And we, in fact, did find that students from our classes, and we have classes that include Palestinian students and Jewish students, Americans, students from Bangladesh, from all over the world. And they don't always agree, including Jewish students, right wing, left wing, but they care about each other. And after October 7th, they got in touch with each other and they asked, how are you doing emotionally? Even if they don't agree politically, they try to be supportive of one another. That is very important. They are open to each other. They care about each other. They're trying to work this out together.
That is remarkable in the current atmosphere around the world and here in the U.S. And is that dialogue still ongoing today?
Yes, it is. So we immediately organized, thanks again to our president, Sion Bailak, funds to actually add to our curriculum additional courses on Israel, to bring in guest speakers who are themselves in dialogue, Israelis, Palestinians, and we have launched a whole series of what we call Middle Eastern dialogue. Our point is not to bring in people who represent a particular political point of view, but to bring in people who are working toward the goal of overcoming this horrific war, of ending it, of bringing peace, of stopping the terror, of creating viable lives for everyone in the Middle East. That's the goal. So we want people who have constructive ideas, not people who will simply march in and start damning one side or the other.
Not propaganda. And you've mentioned that the good relationship between the Jewish Studies Department and the Middle Eastern Studies Department was key to this effort. Academically, this is incredibly important on a day-to-day basis beyond the past year. But as you well know, this isn't the case in so many of leading universities. Many of them are completely disconnected.
I find it completely unacceptable as a professional for faculty members not to be in contact with each other, not to collaborate. That's unacceptable. I can imagine, well, what would you do if you were a patient in a hospital and your doctor and your nurse or your two doctors weren't speaking to each other because they had political differences? It's completely unacceptable. We cannot have a society like that in any way, in any field, and that includes the academy. So that has to stop. And if you are not able to get along with your colleagues and with students and be open to all of your students, not to present yourself, by the way, I feel very strongly about this. I don't present my political viewpoints to my students. I tell them, come to me, talk to me. I've heard everything. I have friends, right wing, left wing. Come and talk to me. Let's discuss it. That's what's important. I want my classes to be open to everyone and not to be classes that are coded as a particular political perspective. But for faculty not to be on speaking terms, Jewish studies and Middle Eastern studies, for them to condemn one another and so on, it's unacceptable. And of course, it's also unacceptable for people who have no training in the field to offer courses. This is absurd. I am not going to teach a course on organic chemistry because I don't know anything about it. Why should somebody who knows nothing about the history of Israel or of Palestinians or Middle East in general teach courses about the conflict? That can't be allowed. I wouldn't allow someone to teach a course in physics based on a 1950s textbook. That would be an outrage. It's unacceptable at a university. And the same is true in this field. So when I see people trying to teach such courses at different universities for political reasons, I say on professional grounds, this is not to be permitted, period. That's where the administration has to come in and say it's unacceptable.
Your story really highlights the crucial role faculty members and the president play in shaping discourse and leading change within universities. But what we've seen over the past year is quite the opposite. Many faculty members of universities have not only supported these protests, but also turned classrooms into spaces that reject differing viewpoints.
Yes, we do see that. And the question is, how do we monitor? What do we do to make sure that are not subjected to that? And there is a lot of it going around. And this is something that I think has come to the fore this past year, since October 7th, that some faculty members do present, I know this, and present their political viewpoint in a very passionate way. And then they say to the class, now, what do you think? Now, what's the student supposed to do at that point? What if the student disagrees with the professor? Then they become anxious. Well, will my grade be affected? Will my relationship with the professor be affected? It's unacceptable. It's foolish and it's immature and it's unacceptable. That's it. That has to stop. That's unprofessional.
Have other universities approached you for guidance on implementing your model? I mean, do you see expanding your influence beyond Dartmouth as a goal now?
Yes, we have been contacted by more universities than I can count. And I've gone together with either Tarek El-Aris or another colleague as a Dean Fashir, and we have spoken to private high schools, prep schools, but also to many universities and colleges. We've been asked to come and consult with deans and presidents what to do, and we're continuing to do that. I would just say that in most cases, we're willing to, of course, to be helpful in any way we can when conflicts exist at other colleges and universities. It's also clear to us that there has to be a commitment on the part of the president and the administration. We're worried that after October 7th, so many colleges didn't know what to do and did not turn to the faculty the way our president did to organize dialogue. I think another problem that we have is that we are very polarized in the United States and many other countries, and colleges are polarized, students are polarized, faculty are polarized. What we're seeing in many colleges is an effort to institute regulations regarding anti-Semitism. So the IHRA statement, for instance, and anti-Semitism was just accepted by Harvard University. And I don't know how that will work ultimately, how successful it will be. My own personal feeling is that instead of trying to rule against certain ideas and prejudices, we need to educate. The question is how to do that. We think our model has worked well. We can't convince everybody at Dartmouth. Not all students take our classes. Not all of our faculty colleagues agree with us. Fine, but we do the best we can, and at least that's the effort we're making. Obviously, interrupting a class, loud demonstrations that don't allow meetings to take place, any kind of vandalism and so on, that's against college rules, period. However, for whatever cause it's done. But I'm talking about something more subtle. And honestly, I do worry about it. I worry that Israel is often taken as the negative example in different fields. In the social sciences, for example, that Israel's occupation of the West Bank, what happened after 67 and so on, certain things that are problems in Israel that we all recognize are held up as the sole example of the negative. That's as rampant in certain fields. I also think that it's at times very irresponsible, given the political conditions in which we're now living, with a so-called MAGA Republican Party controlling the White House, the Senate, the Congress, and it seems also the Supreme Court, a kind of dissolution of the rule of law that we're beginning to see. That's very problematic. How do we function in that kind of a setting? And for academics to take a very strident position against Israel in that kind of an environment is only going to lead to the closure of universities. It's going to lead to retaliation on the part of this particular government. So the question is, how does one have a political point of view and feel passionate about that political point of view? But how does one have a strategy in this political context in which we're now living. May I also just make another point about this academic situation? What October 7th revealed to us is a self-destruction of many academics, a self-destruction through irresponsibility and often immaturity, a self-destruction that has placed a certain political viewpoint above a commitment to their own scholarship, to their own field. And the prime example of that is a feminist theory. Two major feminist theorists, two of the most important, many of them, but two of the most important, Judith Butler and Nancy Fraser, have said that it wasn't rape on October 7th, it was resistance. Now, the bottom line in feminist scholarship, and I am a feminist scholar, is that rape doesn't matter what the woman is wearing, how short her skirt is, or what her political viewpoints is, or her citizenship, or anything else. Rape is rape. For them to abandon that foundation of feminist theory is to destroy the field, and I'm outraged by that.
Ultimately, the guiding principle you follow and teach your students shouldn't be something exceptional. It should be the standard in any academic institution that values free and profound thought, that the idea that it's perfectly fine to disagree, but let's do it in a civilized manner through mutual dialogue, not in echo chambers or through verbal violence. These are the values our children are learning in kindergarten. So how did it become such a rare vision in our universities?
Well, that's a big question and an important question that historians are going to have to analyze moving forward. And I'm not sure we're ready quite yet to trace that. There are ways in which I understand certain colleagues who feel that there is a terrible repressive atmosphere emerging in the United States, that there is an effort to control books in libraries and curriculum of public schools as well as public universities and so on. And they're outraged by that, and they feel very passionate about it, and I appreciate that. My concern, though, would be the question of strategy, first of all. I don't think books on the Holocaust should be removed from public libraries, for instance, as they are now in certain parts of the United States. Kansas just, well, I won't go into that. But why has this, and here's the danger, this issue has become how people define themselves. They define themselves politically and also intellectually by getting up and saying, I support BDS. It's a point of definition. It's not a carefully worked through political analysis with a goal in mind, with a strategy and so forth. It's a cultural code. That's what Shulamit Volkov from Tel Aviv University called this kind of thing. This is how I present myself to the world. This is who I am. One of the things that I did recently was to try to counter American Ivy League students who are very privileged and don't know very much about the conflict, but who want to present themselves as being on the Palestinian side. I wanted to counter that by bringing an Israeli Palestinian citizen who writes in Hebrew novels, TV shows, screenplays, and that's Syed Kashua. I brought him to give a public lecture, which was great, and then I brought him to teach a class at Dartmouth because I wanted the students to understand it's not that simple. He writes in Hebrew. He grew up in Israel. He has, of course, a difficult time with the current situation, as do many Israelis. But to be a Palestinian Israeli, of course, brings up some very problematic issues in many ways, culturally, legally, in all kinds of ways. And I wanted them to understand the complexity of it, that it's not that simple. And that for them to march around and say, end to Israel, something like that, what's that going to do for anybody? What does BDS accomplish for Palestinian citizens of Israel? If you want to boycott an academic institution in Israel, where the students are also Arab and faculty members are Arab, you're going to boycott them too? So the absurdity of it is something that needs to be brought across, as well as, by the way, the fact that they may want to boycott Israel, but what if Israel boycotted them? And what would they do? They would have to give up their iPhone and their laptop computers and their generic medicines and all the many technological and medicinal and scientific discoveries that are coming out of Israel. So they need to think about it. It has to be pointed out to them. The kind of rhetoric by which they define themselves as political people, as even as an American, and so that chain of language needs to be broken. And that's what we're trying to do with the dialogue project, with the classes, the co-taught classes, and so on. Having two professors in the classroom is not about two political perspectives. That's not what it's about. It's about two areas of expertise. So I taught a course with a colleague who works on Egypt, from the 50s to the present, Egypt's political cultural history. And we taught a course on the 1967 war. And we each brought different background. I was, of course, there to talk about history of Zionism and Israel and so on. But the point is to show the students that we learn from each other. We're in a classroom to learn, not to spout political rhetoric, not to agitate politically.
I'd like to continue on to the topic of anti-Semitism that has been a central focus of your research for many years. In a recent paper, you argue that anti-Semitism isn't just hatred or just an ideology, but should be understood as a kind of cultural sadism, where people derive satisfaction from seeing pain and trauma inflicted on Jews. Can you walk us through this intriguing argument?
Yes, well, the work that I've done on anti-Semitism is primarily focused on Germany, 19th and 20th century. I've written a book about the Nazi period, but I've also written on the late 19th century as anti-Semitism took shape. I've also written about Christianity and the role of Christian ideas. I would say a couple of things led me to realize that we are not adequate as scholars in the way we have been studying anti-Semitism. In what ways? What do I mean? First of all, there was a book that came out actually from some Israeli scholars on the history of pogroms. In the introduction, there was one sentence that said, and thousands of women were raped, period. And nothing more in the whole book. So one thing is, first, as a woman, I want to know, well, I want to hear what happened. I want to know more. It's not so simple. Thousands of women. There are consequences to that. It's also questions of motivation and so on. But then another issue. In the United States, we have a strong field of African American studies, and the scholars of enslavement in the United States have written about the trauma of course, of being enslaved, but also the cruelty of these white slave owners. The cruelty is very much one-on-one, that is, whipping people and torturing people, the horror of that. And then I thought, we don't read much about that in studies of anti-Semitism, the torture and the trauma. Now, what I was interested in was in witnessing trauma. What does it mean to witness the trauma that you inflict on someone? I would say for me, if someone is in pain for any reason, it's horrible for me. I want to immediately help or call for help, get a doctor, an ambulance, whatever. It's horrible. But there are people for whom it brings pleasure to see someone suffering, and people who actually inflict the pain and take pleasure from seeing the trauma that they create. So I want to understand that too in connection with Jewish experience. And that certainly comes up with the pogroms, but it also came up after October 7th, because immediately the next day, there was a professor at Cornell University, Russell Rickford, who went to a rally in New York City and said that he felt exhilarated. Exhilarated?
It was exhilarating. Yeah. It was exhilarating. It was energizing. And if they weren't exhilarated by this challenge to the monopoly of violence, by this shifting of the balance of power, then they would not be human. I was exhilarated.
1,200 people were massacred the day before, and you're exhilarated? You may be indifferent, perhaps. You may say, well, they deserve it, or something you can say. But to be exhilarated is another level.
And you mentioned that word. You used the word exhilaration in the essay. Did you write the essay after October 7th?
No.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, because I thought about October 7th in every paragraph I read in the article, thinking precisely about that exhilarating speech that he gave.
Yes. Well, that word has been used not just by him, but by others as well. And so that's the difference between being callous and being sadistic. We heard a lot about the callousness of Nazis. Daniel Goldhagen wrote a book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, in which he said, we can't just talk about callousness and indifference. No, there's something more going on here. I agree.
After you wrote the article and October 7th happened, and I mentioned, how deep that resonated with me because of what we all saw on October 7th, especially the videos of ecstatic crowds in Gaza celebrating the kidnapping and injuries of Israelis, and the fact that the terrorists didn't try to hide their atrocities, but filmed them, sometimes even live streaming them. What do you understand from that after writing this article?
Well, I think this question of sadism is something that needs further examination. It's hard to draw sort of blanket conclusions and talk about it, some kind of sadistic personality, just like the authoritarian personality of Horkheimer and Adorno. I think I think they, by the way, they sort of hinted in their book about that, about sadism, I mean. But I think the other question we need to ask, what you're asking me is, how do we understand their sadism? That's one question. The other question is, what does it make us as Jews feel like to be the targets of that kind of sadism, of that kind of sadistic pleasure? And it didn't, of course, start October 7th. It goes back, it's much earlier. And the question is, when we think about the history of anti-Semitism, when do we begin to see that kind of sadism? How do we see the roots of it that would be actually particular to anti-Semitism and different, not necessarily applicable to all forms of racial hatred? There are many in the world. And we're not the only targets of sadistic cruelty, obviously, racially based sadistic cruelty.
The question arises, wouldn't this argument about cultural sadism apply to any form of racism? Or do you think there's something unique about anti-Semitism in this regard?
No, I think people all over the world can and have been sadistic, without question. But in each case, we have to understand the political and cultural configuration in its own way. And that may change. It varies, obviously. I think during the pogroms in Russia, there was a particular kind of sadistic mentality, just as an example. So there are reports from Jewish women being raped by a man whom they had rocked in the cradle when they were babies. So here is somebody you held as a baby who grows up and rapes you. We also have to think about rape in that context of Christians against Jews. And I see rape as an attack that is, since the penultimate attack, because it's an attack on the body, it's an attack that has a lasting impact. It's not like breaking somebody's arm or leg. It can lead to disease for the woman, to infertility, to death, to having a baby, to being shunned by husband and family and community. Their consequences are enormous. Rape is also an attack against the religion, because all religions begin in the very beginning with questions of gender, questions of purity and sexuality. So to rape is an assault on the foundation of the religion also. It's the greatest desecration can take against a religion, the greatest. It's greater than destroying a Torah scroll, which I would say perhaps a second. But to rape Jewish women is to rape Judaism. How do we as Jews, how do we live with that knowledge that we're not just, disliked or denigrated with anti-Semitic rhetoric, but that there is a quality to our Western culture that wants to subject us to sadistic cruelty and would take pleasure from the trauma they inflict. So what does that do to us?
Fragility, I would say, among other things.
Sure, of course, fragility, but also how does one respond to fragility? Sometimes we respond to fragility with tears, with fear, with rage. There are all kinds of ways to respond.
Anti-Semitism, as you describe it, exists across different political ideologies and societies. What makes it such a resilient form of hatred, in your view?
It's very available. It's such an easy, available commodity. It's inexpensive. There's such a low price to pay for it. So yes, one can be anti-Semitic in any kind of political direction, religious direction, social direction. You can do almost anything with anti-Semitism. It's a very easy and convenient way to explain problems in the world. What could be easier? Part of it is the difference between Jews and, say, Black Americans. Black Americans are viewed as, with contempt, as inferior people and denigrated. Jews are viewed as powerful. And that is an important distinction, because when someone is powerful, then you can explain a lot.
And
They
it's
can be
legitimate to
called-
attack him as well.
And you can attack them.
Is there a way to effectively counter anti-Semitism, given its deep emotional and cultural roots, as you describe them?
Part of it is also when someone says, look, the Jews have been hated for 2,000 years all over the world. Wherever you go, there's anti-Semitism. There must be something wrong with Jews. So how do you overcome an explanation like that? So the explanation reinforces, of course, the prejudice. So is there a way to overcome this? I don't know. I wonder, is there a way to overcome a sadistic impulse?
It may sound naive, but your argument raises the questions. Are so many of us as humans actually sadists?
Oh, yeah. I think there is a sadistic impulse in every human being. The question is, what do we do with it? Do we act it out, or is there something that we find unsatisfying about it? One can be sadistic in verbally and say something really mean, nasty to another person. Of course, I've had that experience. Someone I thought was my good friend for many years said something really mean to me. Why? Why would you do that? The more important question is that person didn't mind saying it. I might think something about a person and say, this person, I think something very negative, but I don't say it because I don't like to say it, because it doesn't give me pleasure to say it. So the issue is, yes, we all have the capacity for sadistic thoughts and feelings. Some of us translate those feelings into action, verbal or physical, and take pleasure.
Following that, taking into account your analysis of anti-Semitism, I assume you weren't as surprised as many of us by the resurgence of anti-Semitism in America. And yet, I wonder what makes a group of people socially sadistic, and why is it happening now much more than 20 or 30 years ago in the United States?
I spent some time as a student and later as a junior professor, not only reading Nazi anti-Semitic material, but also I spent time in Germany. There I heard some things that were really quite horrible, blaming Judaism for the Holocaust, for example. Someone wrote a book saying that the Nazis obey the commands of Hitler just like the Jews obey the commandments of God. It's outrageous, and it's anti-Semitic. Some people in Germany understood it was anti-Semitic immediately, and some people didn't and wanted me to explain it, and some people said, I don't think there's anything anti-Semitic about that. Now, because there were so few Jews at that time in Germany and at German universities, the people I was discussing this with had never met Jews, hadn't talked to Jews. In some sense, it was a kind of sadism in the wilderness without an awareness of its impact. And that, again, is another distinction, perhaps, but it is helpful to them when someone comes and says, this is very hurtful to me. This is unacceptable. Do you realize what you're saying? Think about it from the perspective of the other person. Some people suddenly realize, oh, yes. Some people don't. But I'm a teacher. I educate. I have to work on it. That's what I'm here for.
I'd love to take a moment to shift to something more personal. Your father, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, a towering figure in Jewish history, and we will talk about his legacy and activism. But before Heschel the rabbi, I would love to hear from you about Heschel the Abba and your relationship of father and daughter.
Well, so my father was a wonderful father. He was full of fun, and because when he was a child, he was brilliant and he was studying all the time, and he would give learned talks even as a little boy. He didn't really have that kind of childhood with toys and games, and so he enjoyed it. He really loved being a father, and he loved telling me stories and playing with my toys with me, playing school. I was the teacher, he was the student, he and my mother. I'm an only child. So, and actually, when I was in elementary school, there was a boy in my class, Joseph Lowe, who was very exuberant and was always interrupting the class and telling a joke and making everybody laugh, and the teacher would get mad at him. Joseph, be quiet. And so my father loved that. And so when we played school, he wanted to be Joseph Lowe. And he went, and that was great. And I saw Joseph Lowe many years later and told him that. Anyway, yeah. But my father was also very understanding. So we actually never argued about, for example, why couldn't women become whatever it was that women couldn't do very much when I was growing up. I would tell him, and he said, you're right, things have to change. And in fact, things have changed. I mean, when I was a girl, for women to study Talmud was unthinkable. I wanted a bat mitzvah. He said, fine. I said, I want to chant the Haftorah. He said, fine. I didn't even ask to learn Torah because it was beyond beyond any idea I could think of. But he supported me always.
How old were you when you first remember having conversations with him about Judaism, about faith or philosophy?
I used to go to his lectures even when I was 4 years old, and I loved to go to his lectures, and I felt there was no question in my mind that what he said was correct, or what he said was what Judaism was. And what bothered me was that not everybody saw it the same way, including at my school. That when he spoke about prayer in a very powerful way for me, and I would say, what about girls? What about our prayer? And what about our davening or being a shliach tzibur? I remember once a rabbi gave a sermon about, it was before Pesach, and he said, well, Pesach, the Seder, the Haggadah, it's all about Father conveying Judaism to the Son. And when it was over, I went over to him. I said, well, what if the father only has a daughter? And he just turned away and walked away from me. It was clear he never thought of it, and he was embarrassed or annoyed or whatever. That kind of thing. My father never would have talked that way. And for him, I think it was wonderful that he had a daughter who wanted more of Jewish life.
Moving on to your father's legacy, during the past year since the war started, do you ever think about how your father would perceive the current situation, the deep crisis we face on both sides of the ocean? What do you think is most relevant in your father's moral legacy at this moment?
Honestly, I miss my father every day enormously. And at the same time, I know many of us feel, if my father were alive today and saw what happened, he would be so devastated. I would fear for his health. I don't think my father would have been very appreciative of the current government in Israel or in the United States or in most countries in this world. I think he would have tried as hard as he could to bring people together to talk and, in fact, to engage in dialogue, to try to calm the agitation and the anger. I think he could have been effective in that respect, but I think it would have been terribly difficult for him.
The image of your father marching with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma is, of course, iconic. And his later reflection that I felt my legs were praying became a powerful symbol of Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. That moment marked a high point in Jewish Black solidarity. How do you understand the changes in that relationship since then and the significant distancing we've seen today?
Well, it sends to two things. First of all, I would say that my father's involvement in the civil rights movement was very meaningful to American Jews. That Dr. King lifted up the Hebrew Bible, Moses, and the prophets. The story of the Exodus is central to the civil rights movement. Not Jesus, not the Sermon on the Mount, but the Hebrew Bible. That, I think, was a balm for our wounded souls after the Shoah. I think that was extraordinary also for my father. He came from Nazi Germany, where there were Protestant theologians who said that the so-called Old Testament was a Jewish book, and they threw it out of the Christian Bible. And then he comes to America, and here he meets Dr. King, who has such respect. And the motto of the civil rights movement is a verse from the prophet Amos. So, of course, that was something extraordinary for my father. And then at the same time, I've been meeting civil rights leaders for years. I was invited to a reunion of civil rights leaders in California just a few years ago. And every time I do, they hug me, they kiss me, they embrace me, they thank me for my father. Just think about that. That was 60 years ago. And they're grateful to this day and express gratitude. Now, there's a moral lesson there and a religious lesson. To feel gratitude after 60 years, to express one's gratitude, not to say, well, we're moving on. Now, that's amazing. That's a very important lesson for me, that I too need to express my gratitude. Now, if you ask about sort of what's happened, of course things have happened, good and bad, both. I think with the death of my father and the death of Dr. King, then took over a lot of political developments and things that were problematic on both sides. Jews didn't like affirmative action. Well, I'm a Jew. I'm also a woman, and affirmative action is very important to me. And I point that out. And Jewish men will say, oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. Yeah, you're a woman. Yeah, okay. So it's good for Jews too. Yeah, they don't understand it. But my father wasn't there to explain it to them. But beyond that, there's a notion that there's certain black political leaders that have not been very friendly to Jews or who are very critical of Israel and so on, who support BDS. I don't like that. Sure. But there are also a lot of black intellectuals whom I've been working with, academics, pastors, ministers in the black church, and also black rabbis. I think there's still a very lively conversation going on. We had a meeting at Harvard last spring, coming together as black and Jewish intellectuals, black Jews, black Christians. And I saw, I don't know, not everybody seems to be aware of it. But but we have this. And I think also what I think about, for example, Terrence Johnson, who's a professor at Harvard Divinity School, who's a black theologian. For him, my father's involvement and Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement is a moment of inspiration for him as a black Christian. It's a moment of inspiration because it shows how you can have allies who work together and help each other. And there is no other time more than now that we need allies. We do need allies. And if somebody doesn't agree with me, fine, let's sit down and talk about it. I don't expect people to feel passionate about Israel the way I do if they're not Jewish. Of course not. How can I expect that? But we can talk about it. I can explain how I feel. They explain how they feel. Okay, we may disagree, but they're willing to listen to me. I also have to say that there are times when people say things I find terrible, and the same person can say something that I find wonderful. Well, what do I do about that?
It all goes back to candid dialogue, just like in the Dartmouth case.
Yes. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez organized a seminar on anti-Semitism. And for that, she was kicked out of the Democratic Socialists of America. It's outrageous. And I know she's had some problematic statements regarding Israel, to put it mildly, but at the same time, she made an amazing speech on behalf of women's rights and not denigrating women and not patronizing women. And I appreciate that speech. So am I allowed to also have this kind of appreciation as well as rejection? Of course. And there are people who don't like some things I say. Do I get thrown out for that? No.
Rabbi Heschel had a very interesting view about the importance and the necessity of both Israel and the diaspora, describing them as a trunk and branches, all part of the same tree. Can you tell us a bit about how he viewed Israel and the diaspora in conversations you had with him?
Well, I grew up in love with Israel. That was conveyed to me by my parents. And there was no question about that. I didn't think there were any problems to worry about with Israel until a bit later when I became a teenager and people said things about women that I didn't like. Your womb belongs to the state and your only job is to have babies. Things like that are very troubling. But we loved Israel. My parents took me to Israel several times. We lived in Israel for summers a couple of times in Jerusalem. And my father had friends in Israel. President Shazar invited my father to travel for 2 months and give lectures all over Israel, which he did. I was with him. That was wonderful. So at the same time, my father wrote a book after the 67 war in which he said, you know, we don't worship the soil. Israel is not a compensation for Auschwitz. It may make the pain a little bit less unendurable, but this is not a compensation. I don't think he would have been happy with some of the developments that occurred after he died. So my father was in the 60s, represented one branch of American Jews. It said, after the Shoah, never again to anybody. And there was Meir Kahana who said, after the Shoah, never again to the Jews. So which direction do you want to go in? My father spoke out against the war in Vietnam, and he spoke out on behalf of Soviet Jews to let them out, free them. And he spoke out on behalf of Black Americans. And he felt very strongly that there is no possibility of being concerned only for one's own community. So he went to Rome to meet with the Pope, and people criticized him. And my father said, if going to Rome to meet with the Pope will help to save one life, one Jewish life, of course I'm going to go.
What is the most important Jewish lesson your father taught you?
I would say that my father used to say, if there's one word that defines Judaism, it's Rachmanis, compassion. It's our compassion for one another. It's God's compassion for us. And it's our compassion for God who created this world and looks at it and says, look what these people are doing to each other. So I would say, yes, Rachmanis.
We all need that these days, especially. As we're heading the ends of our conversation, I have a little disclosure to make. Actually, it's a bit of a full circle moment. I always say that actually I owe my career as a journalist and TV news anchor to Rabbi Heschel and the school in New York that bears his name. Because as a child, we lived in Manhattan for a few years while my father was an Israeli diplomat. And I spent 2 years in the Heschel School's kindergarten. Now, before lunch, all the kids in class would say the bracha, the blessing together. And apparently I was a bit of a talkative child, and I didn't really connect much to the prayer, I guess. And after calling me out a few times without much success, one day after the blessing, my teacher asked me to stand on the chair and recite the blessing alone in front of all the kids sitting around me. I suppose that the idea was to make me feel a little embarrassed, so I would change my behavior. But what happened is that, at that moment, as I stood there, just before I started reciting the blessing, I suddenly realized that actually I really enjoy standing in front of an audience and speaking, and that I wanted to have more moments like that in my life. So thank you to Rabbi Heschel, and thank you to my kindergarten teacher at the Heschel School.
Oh, that's great. What a great story.
And after I took that off my chest, and before we depart, this is a small treat. Our Jewish Crossroads questionnaire, 5 quick and fun questions. Are you ready, Professor Heschel?
Okay.
What's your earliest Jewish memory?
I think it's Simchas Torah when I was about 3 in a little Hasidic shtibel, a Gerish shtibel on the Upper West Side, with the men dancing as a 3-year-old. I was one hand loving the dancing and the other hand very worried that the men would step on me because I was so short.
If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, ancient or modern, who would it be and why?
Moshe Rabbeinu, because he was the greatest.
What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
I think blessing my children on Fridays and beginning of Shabbat. I think that's the most important and the most meaningful, just as my father blessed me every Friday.
If you could jump 100 years into the future in one sentence, what would you hope to see?
Peace. peace, 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 peace. And I would say peace and flourishing, not only economically, intellectually, scientifically, but also joy. Joy. And I would say joy for Israeli Jews, for Israeli Arabs, for Palestinians, for the Lebanese, the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Saudis. Peace, peace for women as well as men, for children.
I would love to be there to see that with you. And last question, what's one Jewish word, could be Hebrew, English, Yiddish, whatever, that feels particularly meaningful to you right now?
Rachmanis, without question.
Rachmanis. Professor Heschel, toda rabba. Thank you for this meaningful, wonderful conversation.
Thank you. It was good to be with you.
That's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Tomer Atzabi Bar, who edited this chapter. We'll see you next time, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.